First story, Alone in the Adirondacks by Thompson. I had always been an adventurous soul, seeking solitude in the great outdoors to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. So, when I decided to go solo camping in the Adirondack Mountains, I thought I was well prepared for whatever nature might throw at me. Little did I know that the real horrors would come from something far more sinister than the wilderness. I set up camp by a serene lake, miles away from the nearest town or even a hint of civilization. It was an idyllic spot, surrounded by tall pines that whispered in the breeze. The sound of lapping water and the occasional call of a loon made me feel at peace. I had no reason to believe my solo camping trip would turn into a chilling ordeal. The first night went without a hitch, and I lay in my tent listening to the night sounds. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a human voice, distant but distinct. I strained my ears, and it sounded like a man whispering, "Help me." My heart raced, and I wondered if someone was in trouble. I unzipped the tent and peered into the dark forest, but there was nothing to see. Just the trees, the lake, and the moonlight. For a while, I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, the mind can play tricks in the silence of the wilderness. I returned to my sleeping bag, but sleep remained elusive. The next day, I decided to explore the area, hoping to find a source for the eerie voice from the previous night. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I came across a small clearing, and that's when I saw something that made my heart drop. In the center of the clearing, there were several handmade, crude crosses, each adorned with small trinkets and seemingly ancient symbols. It was a chilling sight. I couldn't help but wonder if I had stumbled upon some kind of cult or an old, abandoned ritual site. I decided to pack up and leave. The thought of spending another night there was out of the question. However, as I dismantled my camp, I had a growing sensation that someone was watching me. I turned and scanned the woods, but there was no one in sight. My anxiety reached its peak when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around to see a figure darting behind a tree. My instincts kicked in, and I ran towards the spot, but there was no one there. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Fear gnawed at me as I packed the last of my gear. I hurriedly left the site, not looking back. My heart pounded all the way back to civilization. To this day, I can't forget that chilling voice, the strange symbols, and the feeling of being watched. I may have survived the Adirondacks, but the horrors I encountered in the wilderness still haunt my dreams. Second story, The Unsettling Encounter in the Ozarks by James Anderson. My solo camping trip in the Ozarks promised serenity and a connection to nature, but it quickly turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. I had chosen a remote location deep within the Mark Twain National Forest, where I was certain I wouldn't encounter another soul. As I set up my campsite, I marveled at the untouched beauty of the forest, its dense trees and the distant gurgling of a hidden creek. On the second night, as I sat by my campfire, I began to hear strange noises. At first, it was subtle, a rustling in the bushes, a twig snapping, and whispers that seemed to emanate from all around. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, but the unease grew. As I lay in my tent, I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then, a beam of light pierced through the fabric of my tent. Someone was shining a flashlight right at me. Panic seized me, and I reached for my camping knife. The flashlight moved away, and I heard murmured voices. It sounded like two men having a heated argument. They were close, far too close for comfort. I strained to hear what they were saying, and it sent chills down my spine. One of the men said, "We have to do it now. He knows too much." The other replied, "Are you sure we won't get caught?" The response was sinister and cold. "We've done it before, haven't we?" I knew I had to get out of there. I quietly unzipped my tent and crawled out, careful not to make a sound. I slinked through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. It was pitch dark, and I had no idea where I was going, but the need to escape those men drove me deeper into the forest. I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin, and in my desperation, I pushed the creaky door open. Inside, it was dank and musty, with decades of dust and cobwebs covering the furniture. I hid in the corner, praying they hadn't seen me. Through the cracked window, I saw the flashlight beams drawing near the cabin. The two men were searching for me. They shone their lights inside the cabin, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I held my breath, my fingers trembling around the handle of my knife. Miraculously, they moved away, still arguing about their sinister plan. I waited until their voices faded into the distance before I dared to leave the cabin. I walked for hours in the dark, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and those men. Finally, I reached a road, and a passing motorist gave me a ride back to safety. I reported the incident to the authorities, but the two men were never found. To this day, I don't know what they were planning or why they targeted me. The Ozarks, once a place of natural beauty and solitude, had become a haunting memory of a night filled with terror. Third story: The Mysterious Disappearances in the Black Hills by Robert Miller. My solo camping trip in the Black Hills of South Dakota began as an escape from the daily grind, but it ended up plunging me into a chilling mystery that I still can't explain. I had chosen a campsite by a pristine mountain lake, surrounded by dense pine forests. The beauty of the place was breathtaking, and I couldn't have asked for a better location. The first 2 nights were peaceful, with nothing to disturb my solitude. On the third night, however, things took a dark turn. As I lay in my tent, I heard strange whispers, like the faint muttering of voices. I strained to listen, but the words were indistinct. At first, I assumed it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder and more persistent. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching my campsite made me sit up in alarm. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent. In the dim light, I saw a group of people standing around the campfire I had extinguished earlier. They were dressed in tattered clothing, their faces obscured by shadow. I couldn't make out their features, but their presence sent a shiver down my spine. I cleared my throat, trying to sound brave. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" One of them stepped forward, and a glint of metal in his hand caught my eye. It was a knife. "We don't mean any harm," he said, his voice strained. "We're just lost and hungry. Can you spare some food?" My instincts told me something was off, but I wanted to help. I offered them some food from my supplies, but as they approached to take it, I realized their faces were unnaturally pale, almost ashen. Their eyes had a vacant, distant look. I handed them the food, and they thanked me in hushed, eerie voices. I watched as they shuffled away into the darkness, the whispers following them. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with these people. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. As I walked back to the trailhead, I noticed a missing person poster nailed to a tree. The faces on the posters were eerily similar to the people I had encountered the previous night. It was then that I realized I might have narrowly escaped a sinister fate. I reported the incident to the authorities, and an investigation was launched. It turned out that there had been a series of unexplained disappearances in the Black Hills over the years, and those I encountered might have been the missing victims. To this day, the mystery remains unsolved, and the memory of those pale, whispering figures in the Black Hills haunts my every camping trip. Fourth story: The Haunting Echoes of Bryce Canyon by Emily Davis. Bryce Canyon National Park was the last place I expected to encounter something otherworldly during my solo camping trip. The stunning red rock formations and eerie hoodoos held an allure that I couldn't resist, but I had no idea that the canyon had secrets of its own. I had set up my campsite in a quiet area, far away from the bustling visitor center. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I was treated to a breathtaking view of the night sky, with a multitude of stars winking overhead. Everything seemed perfectly normal until I heard a distant, haunting sound. It started as a low, mournful wail that echoed through the canyon. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but then the sound grew louder and more distinct. It was as if the very earth itself was groaning in agony. Fear began to creep into my bones as the eerie wail reverberated through the canyon. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured to the rim to get a better sense of where the sound was coming from. As I shone my light into the darkness, I saw shadowy figures moving among the hoodoos. They were hooded, their faces hidden, and they seemed to be in a trance-like state. The eerie wailing continued as they moved in a slow, solemn procession. I watched in disbelief, wondering if it was some kind of bizarre, late-night tour or performance. But then, I noticed something that sent shivers down my spine. The figures weren't casting any shadows in the moonlight. It was as though they were part of the night itself. Suddenly, they turned to face me, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. Without a word, they began to move toward the rim where I stood. Panic washed over me, and I stumbled backward, scrambling to pack up my campsite. As I made my escape, the haunting wails followed me, and I could hear their footsteps approaching. The eerie feeling of being pursued in the dark was suffocating. I didn't dare look back until I reached the park entrance, and when I did, there was no sign of the hooded figures. I reported the incident to the park rangers, but they assured me there were no authorized events or tours taking place in the park that night. The hooded figures remained a mystery, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something otherworldly in the depths of Bryce Canyon. Fifth story: The Sinister Secrets of the Shawnee National Forest by Mark Turner. My solo camping trip in the Shawnee National Forest of southern Illinois had been intended as a simple getaway, but it took a chilling turn that still sends shivers down my spine. I had chosen a secluded spot near the Garden of the Gods, a place known for its breathtaking rock formations and serene beauty. The first night was uneventful, but on the second night, I was awakened by strange, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. The chanting was eerie and unsettling, with a guttural quality that made my hair stand on end. I peered out of my tent but couldn't see anything. The forest was pitch black, and the moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy of trees. The chanting continued, and I realized it was growing closer. Panic set in as I considered the possibility of encountering a group of people in the middle of the night, deep in the woods. With my heart pounding, I retreated further into my tent, clutching my camping knife. The chanting grew louder and more intense, and I could hear distinct words in a language I couldn't understand. It sent a shiver of fear down my spine, and I knew I had to leave. I silently packed my gear, waiting for a lull in the chanting, and then made my move. As I slipped out of my tent and into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The chanting continued, but I was determined to escape the eerie atmosphere. I hiked through the dark forest for hours, guided only by the dim light of my flashlight. Eventually, I reached a ranger station and reported the strange occurrence. The rangers were baffled but promised to investigate. As I left the forest, I couldn't help but wonder what had caused the eerie chanting and what sinister secrets might be hidden deep within the Shawnee National Forest. Sixth story: The Creeping Dread of Colorado's Maroon Bells by Jessica Sanders. My solo camping trip near the Maroon Bells in Colorado was meant to be an escape into the beauty of the Rocky Mountains, but it turned into a nightmarish experience I can't forget. I had chosen a spot by Crater Lake, and the view of the Maroon Bells was simply breathtaking. The first night, I was lulled to sleep by the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore and the serene beauty of the surrounding wilderness. But on the second night, that tranquility was shattered. I awoke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized the whispers were words, faint and indistinct. They seemed to be coming from the woods that surrounded my campsite. I held my breath and strained my ears. The whispers grew louder, and I could make out phrases like, "Don't go there," and "He's watching." Panic welled up inside me as I considered the possibility of being watched by someone in the darkness. I cautiously unzipped my tent and shone my flashlight in the direction of the whispers. What I saw froze me in my tracks. In the distance, beneath the towering Maroon Bells, there was a figure standing on the shore of the lake. The figure was shrouded in darkness, and I couldn't make out any details. As I watched, the figure raised its hand and pointed in my direction. My heart raced, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though the figure was warning me to stay away. I had no choice but to pack up my camp and leave. The feeling of being watched never left me as I hiked back to civilization. I reported the strange encounter to the park rangers, but they assured me that no one should have been in the area at that time. The Maroon Bells, which had once been a symbol of natural beauty, were now a haunting memory of a night filled with inexplicable whispers and an eerie, shadowy figure. Seventh story: The Haunting Murmurs of New England's White Mountains by Michael Reynolds. The White Mountains of New Hampshire were my chosen destination for a solo camping trip, a place of rugged beauty and quiet solitude. Little did I know that the tranquility of these woods held secrets that would leave me haunted. I had set up camp near the Appalachian Trail, miles away from the nearest town. The first night was peaceful, with only the sounds of the forest and the distant rustling of leaves to keep me company. But on the second night, a strange sensation overcame me. I was awakened by a subtle, yet unsettling sound, a soft, almost melodic murmuring. I strained to listen, but it was too faint to discern any words. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but it had an eerie, otherworldly quality to it. The murmurs seemed to emanate from all around me, as though the forest itself was whispering secrets I couldn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest as the sound grew louder, and I realized that it was coming closer. I unzipped my tent, peering into the darkness, and there, standing among the trees, were shadowy figures. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and their faces were obscured by darkness. The murmurs continued, and it felt as if they were speaking to me, even though I couldn't comprehend their words. I backed into my tent, my mind racing with fear. The figures moved closer, and their forms seemed to flicker and fade in the moonlight. It was as though they were not quite of this world. My fear escalated, and I knew I had to escape. I packed up my campsite as quickly as I could, but the murmurs continued, filling the air with an eerie, haunting presence. I hiked through the dark forest, guided only by the dim light of my flashlight, desperately trying to put distance between myself and those shadowy figures. I reached a trailhead and reported this strange encounter to the park rangers. They listened with a grave expression but couldn't offer any explanation for the eerie murmurs and the ghostly figures I had encountered. The White Mountains, once a place of natural beauty and solitude, had become a haunting memory of a night filled with inexplicable whispers and the shadowy, otherworldly presence. 8th story: The Petrifying Incident in Oregon's Crater Lake by Alex Turner. Crater Lake, in the southern part of Oregon, was my chosen destination for a solo camping trip. Its deep blue waters and serene beauty made it the perfect spot for solitude. However, my visit took a dark and terrifying turn that I still struggled to comprehend. I had set up my campsite near the lakeshore, and the first night was uneventful, with the stars reflecting in the tranquil water. But on the second night, something changed. I awoke to a strange and guttural sound, a series of low, echoing moans that seemed to come from the depths of the lake itself. At first, I brushed it off as the wind or some natural phenomenon, but the moans grew louder and more distinct. They took on a human quality, as though someone, or something, was crying out in pain. Fear clenched my chest, and I sat up in my tent. As I peered out, I saw ripples on the lake's surface, concentric circles spreading from the center. The moans continued, and it was then that I realized the eerie cries were coming from something beneath the water. I couldn't believe my eyes as the lake's surface began to churn and bubble. A form began to emerge from the water, a spectral figure, pale and translucent, with long, flowing hair. It was as if the lake itself had given birth to a ghostly apparition. The figure continued to moan, its mournful cries echoing through the night. My heart raced, and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it on the ghostly entity. The figure turned to face me, its hollow eyes fixing on mine. It extended a ghostly hand toward me, and the eerie, mournful wailing intensified. I could feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow and despair emanating from the apparition. I knew I had to leave, but the ghostly figure seemed to beckon me with an eerie, compelling force. I forced myself to pack up my campsite and hiked away from the lakeshore as quickly as I could. When I reached civilization, I reported the incident to the park rangers. They listened with a grave expression and told me that stories of a ghostly figure in Crater Lake had been passed down through generations. The encounter had left me shaken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake held dark and mysterious secrets far beyond human understanding. 9th story: The Enigmatic Occurrence in Florida's Okefenokee Swamp by Samantha Richards. My solo camping trip to Florida's Okefenokee Swamp was meant to be a unique adventure into the heart of the wilderness. I wanted to experience the eerie beauty of the swamp's dark waters and hanging moss, but I never expected to uncover an enigma that would fill me with dread. I had set up my campsite near the edge of the swamp, a place surrounded by towering cypress trees and the call of unseen wildlife. The first night was calm, with the frogs serenading me to sleep, but on the second night, everything changed. I was awoken by a sound that sent shivers down my spine, a soft, melodic singing that seemed to come from deep within the swamp. The voice was haunting and beautiful, but there was an undercurrent of sadness that I couldn't ignore. As I listened, the singing grew louder and more entrancing. I unzipped my tent, flashlight in hand, and made my way to the water's edge. There, in the pale moonlight, I saw a figure standing on a patch of floating vegetation. It was a woman, her long hair flowing around her like dark strands of seaweed. She continued to sing, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. It was as though the very swamp itself had given birth to this ethereal being. Her singing was captivating, and I felt a strange compulsion to draw closer to her. As I moved toward the water, my feet sinking into the muck, I suddenly realized that the woman's feet weren't touching the water. She stood above it, her gaze locked onto mine. Her singing took on an eerie quality, and I felt a sense of impending doom wash over me. With great effort, I managed to pull myself away from the swamp's edge. Fear coursed through my veins as I packed up my campsite and hiked away as quickly as I could. The haunting song of the woman continued to echo through the swamp, following me like a sinister refrain. When I reached civilization, I reported the incident to local authorities. They listened with a mixture of disbelief and concern, telling me that stories of a mysterious singing woman in the Okefenokee swamp had been shared for generations. The encounter left me haunted by the inexplicable presence I had encountered in the dark waters of the swamp, a presence that defied all rational explanation. 10th story: The Unnerving Disappearance in Montana's Glacier National Park by John O'Malley. My solo camping trip in Montana's Glacier National Park was meant to be an escape into the rugged wilderness, but it turned into a mystery that still sends chills down my spine. I had chosen a campsite in a secluded area near the Grinnell Glacier Trail. The first night was calm, with the clear night sky filled with stars. But on the second night, something changed. I was awoken by a strange sound, an eerie, high-pitched humming that seemed to come from the surrounding woods. At first, I thought it might be an animal or a bird, but the sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. It sent shivers down my spine. I unzipped my tent and made my way into the darkness with my flashlight. The source of the sound seemed to be a cluster of unusual, bioluminescent mushrooms growing near the base of a tree. Their soft, eerie glow filled the area with an otherworldly light. As I approached the mushrooms, the humming grew louder, and I could feel a strange vibration in the air. It was then that I noticed the mushrooms were arranged in a peculiar pattern, almost like a map. I couldn't decipher its meaning, but it was unnerving. The humming reached a crescendo, and the ground beneath the mushrooms seemed to tremble. In a sudden flash of light, a portal of some kind appeared, swirling with ethereal energy. I couldn't believe my eyes. As I watched in shock, a figure emerged from the portal. It was a hiker, dressed in modern gear, but his expression was one of sheer terror. He reached out toward me, his voice a desperate cry for help, and then he was yanked back into the portal, disappearing in an instant. The portal closed, and the eerie mushrooms returned to their normal state, their glow dimming. I was left in a state of shock, unable to comprehend the bizarre occurrence. In the days that followed, I reported the incident to the park rangers, but they were unable to offer any explanation for what I had witnessed. The mystery of the disappearing hiker and the strange portal in Glacier National Park haunted my thoughts, leaving me with a sense of unease that I'll never forget. Thank you for sticking with us through the whole video. Also, I recommend you this video you see on screen, one of the scariest on my channel. If you haven't already, Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. This helps me bring you more thrilling content every day. If this video sent shivers down your spine, let me know in the comments.